Hi, I'm David Miliband, here to appeal to you to donate before August the 2nd to the International Rescue Committee Milestones Appeal, because every
The stories you're about to hear should be a reminder that life is fragile. Some people are profoundly unlucky, ending up at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and sometimes around the wrong people. A warning before you continue, although this is the cold hard truth of these events, it is still very disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. On January 30th, 2016, a woman named Wu entered the elevator of her building in the Chinese city Xi'an. She pushed the button for the 15th floor and then stood in the elevator waiting for her floor. Just after the 11th floor and before the 12th floor, the elevator malfunctioned and came to a stop. 2 maintenance workers were called to investigate the malfunction and figured out it was a mechanical issue that required a specific part in order to be repaired. They then banged on the door and called out to see if anyone was in the elevator, but heard nothing from inside, and so they shut the power off. This was a huge mistake. They should have opened the doors of the elevator to physically check if anyone was inside first. The building she lived in had 2 elevators, and so residents were instructed to use the other one until the malfunctioning one could be repaired. Inside the other elevator, Wu sat in complete darkness, trapped and with no one coming to help her. The maintenance workers returned on March 1st to perform the repairs, and when they opened the doors, they were horrified to find the decomposing body of Wu. On the inside of the elevator, they found scratch marks from where Wu was desperately trying to claw her way out, and her hands were supposedly mangled from scratching at the doors trying to escape. Although it's unclear exactly how long Wu survived in the elevator, it's likely that she died of dehydration a couple days after the power was cut off. Wu also lived alone and seems to have had minimal contact with friends and family because no one contacted the authorities in the month that she was missing to report her disappearance. Foul play was ruled out, but the maintenance workers who negligently shut off the power were charged with involuntary manslaughter because of their carelessness. Wu was 43 years old at the time of her death. On October 4th, 2007, a law known as Grant's Law was passed in British Columbia, Canada. This law required gas stations in the province to make 2 critical changes to their procedures. First, it required that drivers have to pay for their gas before filling up, and second, it required that all employees working between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. are accompanied by another employee. The reason this law was passed was that had it been in place on March 8th, 2005, it could have prevented something horrifying from happening. That night, on March 5th, 2005, Grant DePatie was working at a gas station in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. At some point during his shift, 16-year-old Darnell Pratt pulled into the gas station to get gas. Unbeknownst to Grant, Darnell was drunk and never intended on paying for the gas. After he pumped his gas, he got into his car and began driving away. When Grant saw this, he tried to cut Darnell off in an attempt to prevent him from stealing the gas. Grant got in front of his car thinking that Darnell would stop, but Darnell didn't. He hit Grant and kept going. Grant then got lodged somewhere underneath the car and was subsequently dragged for 7.5 kilometers before Darnell finally stopped. This ultimately resulted in Grant's death, although it's unclear whether he was killed before or after the car stopped. It's also unclear whether or not Darnell even knew that he hit Grant or not, as the details of the case are limited. However, Darnell was charged as an adult and sentenced to 12 years in prison for manslaughter. Public outcry from this tragedy is what eventually led to the passing of Grant's Law. Isadora Duncan was born on May 26, 1877 in San Francisco, California. Her parents divorced soon after she was born, and so Isadora was raised primarily by her mother Dora. Her mother was a piano teacher and fostered an appreciation for the arts in her children from a young age. At just 6 years old, Isadora began teaching dance-like movements to the other children in her neighborhood. By the age of 10, the class had become so large that Isadora requested to leave school and teach dance full-time with her older sister Elizabeth. She earned an income from that point on, and this sparked her career as a dancer and performer. She went on to live in Chicago and New York, working as a performer before moving to Europe. Her style was controversial for the time, as it defied some of the common conventions of the more popular ballet, but she has since become known as the mother of modern dance. Despite her success, Isadora suffered a number of horrific tragedies throughout her lifetime. First, in 1913, her 2 children and their nanny drowned when the car they were driving fell into the Seine River. In 1922, she married poet Sergei Yesenin, but the marriage would soon fall apart due to Sergei's worsening mental health issues. Then in the mid-1920s, Sergei would commit suicide as a result of these issues. On the evening of September 14, 1927, Isadora was a passenger in the Amilcar CG-SS. This early car was a convertible with big spoked wheels, much like those of a modern-day bicycle. That night, Isadora wore a long, flowing scarf that was gifted to her by her friend Mary Desty. Before leaving in the car, Mary had actually asked Isidore to wear a full cape because of the cold weather and because the car they were going to be driving in was a convertible. Isidore refused the full cape but accepted the scarf. As the car accelerated, Isidore's scarf got wrapped up in the spokes of the wheels and ripped her from the vehicle, killing her almost instantly. Reports from the incident indicate that she was either killed from the force of the scarf pulling on her neck or from how violently she impacted the ground after being thrown from the vehicle. In either case, it was determined she died from a broken neck. After the incident, her remains were cremated and placed next to those of her children in a cemetery in France. 51-year-old Ronald McLegish lived alone in a bungalow in Cambridgeshire, England. He hadn't always lived alone, however. In fact, he had barely lived alone for 2 weeks when the events of this story took place. Ronald had recently hit a patch of bad luck. He was already a divorced father of 2, and then he and his current girlfriend decided to break up, and so she moved out of his bungalow, leaving him to live alone. About 2 weeks later, he was cleaning a large walk-in wardrobe in his home. The doors of this wardrobe opened outward, and perpendicular to this wardrobe was another freestanding dresser. While he was inside, the freestanding dresser somehow toppled over and wedged itself in front of the door of the walk-in wardrobe. With the doors now closed, he was in complete darkness, so he went over to try to push the doors open, but they wouldn't budge. He likely tried to shout for help, but again, he lived alone, so no one was able to hear him. In the dark, in the wardrobe, he felt around to find something to help free himself and found a pipe that ran along the wall. He pulled on it and it broke off the wall, but that caused freezing cold water to begin spraying all over the wardrobe. Now in the dark, with freezing cold water spraying all over him, he started smashing the pipe against the doors and the walls of the wardrobe. Apparently, his neighbors even heard digging noises coming from his house, but they never pursued it any further. Eventually, the digging stopped and Ronald went silent. On February 15th, 2 officers went to his home after friends and family reported not having seen or heard from Ronald in about 2 weeks. It would take the 2 of them to remove the heavy wardrobe, and inside they discovered Ronald's body. It was determined by the coroner that Ronald had died roughly a week earlier from bronchitis. It's unclear whether or not he had developed it during the incident or if it was an existing bout that was worsened by the conditions inside the wardrobe. On April 10, 1917, 18-year-old Grace Fryer started a job as a dial painter at the United States Radium Corporation. World War I had started 4 days prior, and with 2 brothers serving in the army, Grace wanted to help out the war effort in any way she could. Hundreds of other women also flocked to this job to help out in the war effort, and because it paid 3 times more than the average factory job at the time. Working as a dial painter put these women in the top 5% nationally based on their wages. Their task at the studios was to use the newly discovered element radium to paint watches and military dials. In addition to the wages, the radium itself was part of the appeal of the job. Workers soon became known as ghost girls because they would literally glow in the dark after work because of the radium. They would even wear nice dresses to the factory so they could go right to the dance halls after work and glow miraculously to everyone's amazement. Some workers even went as far as to paint their teeth with the radium paint to really stand out. At the studio, they used a technique known as lip pointing, where they would slip the paintbrushes between their lips and create a fine point. Each time they would do this, they would ingest a small amount of paint. Naturally, prior to starting work there, girls would ask whether or not this was dangerous, and managers always reassured them that it was perfectly safe. This, of course, was not true. Radium had been known to cause harm since its discovery by Marie Curie 20 years earlier. Marie Curie herself had suffered radiation burns from handling the radium, and a number of people had already died from radium poisoning. People in the plant even knew it was dangerous because the men who handled it in large quantities wore lead aprons and handled it with ivory tongs. The dial painters, on the other hand, never even got a warning. This is because the thinking at the time was that radium was not harmful in small amounts. It was even touted as health promoting and was used in all sorts of products like radium tonic, cosmetics, butter, milk, and even toothpaste. Newspapers even claimed it added years to your life. This false perception was based on research conducted by the radium firms, who had built an industry around the lucrative product, so they ignored all the danger signs in favor of profits. In 1922, a friend of Grace's named Molly Maggia had to quit because she came down with an unknown sickness. It started off as a simple toothache, and so she went to the dentist and ended up having the tooth pulled. Then it happened to another tooth, and then another, and each one that fell out was replaced by a dark, oozing ulcer. Her limbs then began to ache, and it got so bad that she was eventually unable to walk. By May of that year, Molly had lost almost all of her teeth, and the infection had spread to her lower jaw, the roof of her mouth, and even the bones in her ears. When she went to the dentist was poking around her mouth and he literally pulled her jawbone out with his fingers because it was so brittle and decayed. Molly was literally falling apart and Grace was beginning to have issues now too. She started getting pain in her jaw and feet, and soon many of the other girls began to have issues as well. On September 12th, 1922, the infection spread to Molly's jugular vein, and at 5 p.m. that day, blood began to fill her mouth. With no way of stopping the bleeding, Molly would pass away at the age of 24. Doctors were puzzled by her symptoms and death and had no idea what to make of it, and one by one, Molly's colleagues began dying as well. Their employer denied any responsibility for almost 2 years, but as news continued to spread, the business suffered. In 1924, they hired an independent expert who would confirm the link between the radium and the health issues suffered by the workers. The president of the company was outraged and paid for new studies to be conducted to confirm findings that denied any link. They then went on to lie to the Department of Labor about the previous findings and denounced the claims made by the women as simply trying to have the company pay for their medical expenses. By now, it was obvious to the women that radium was dangerous, but the public still thought radium was perfectly safe. In 1925, a man named Harrison Martland performed a number of tests that confirmed the link between radium and the health problems. He discovered that although it was dangerous to be around radium, ingesting it, even in small quantities, was many thousands of times worse. The radium built up in the bones of the women who ingested it and emitted radiation 24/7. The radiation would literally cause the bones of the women to decay to the point of being like a honeycomb. Grace's back eventually decayed to that point, and she needed to wear a steel back brace all day long. Other women's legs shortened or even spontaneously fractured, and many of them suffered from horrible cancers. Once they ingested enough of the radium, they would actually even glow permanently. Most of them wouldn't notice until one day randomly they would see themselves in a mirror at nighttime and notice they were glowing. And from the time that they made that awful discovery, it was already too late. There was no way of removing the radium. During this time period, the radium industry repeatedly tried to discredit the work of Harrison Martland. Over this time period as well, the workers afflicted by radium poisoning would go on to band together to lead a movement against the radium industry. This was an uphill battle, unfortunately, and most lawyers wouldn't even take the case. They either didn't believe the women, or were scared of the legal weight possessed by the radium firms, or simply didn't think they could overcome the existing legislation. Because at the time, workers who received radium poisoning in a workplace did not receive any compensation. In addition, the statute of limitations was only 2 years, whereas many of the women didn't start to show symptoms for up to 5 years after they began ingesting the radium. Finally, in 1927, a lawyer took the case for Grace and 4 of her colleagues. The women would eventually settle out of court because they had limited time to live at that point, and the company seemed content to drag out the proceedings for as long as possible. Although this wasn't a perfect outcome, it did finally give credibility to their movement, and the case spread like wildfire in the media. Soon, plant workers at radium factories countrywide were outraged and company meetings became riots. Continuing to deny responsibility, the company took out ads to deny health issues and went as far as to interfere with the autopsies conducted on these women. It was later revealed that they even stole some of the radium-riddled bones to cover up their culpability. One by one, dial painters died of the same jaw problems and other huge cancerous bone tumors. One woman, named Irene Law, died of a massive pelvic tumor that was reportedly the size of 2 footballs. In the mid-1930s, following the death of Grace Fryer, a woman named Catherine Donahue continued the fight for the workers. Catherine went on to develop a grapefruit-sized tumor on her hip and lost all of her teeth and then eventually her jawbone. This culminated in her attending court from her deathbed against her doctor's advice to give testimony. The case was finally won by the workers and some semblance of justice was served. The case of the Radium Girls would go on to become a historic case and one of the first that held a company responsible for the health of its workers. This case also led to the implementation of many life-saving regulations and the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA. Prior to its establishment, 14,000 people died annually of work-related causes, and that figure is only 4,500 people today. With a half-life of 1,600 years, the bones of the women who met their horrible ends from the poisoning will continue to glow for hundreds of years. If you made it this far, I just wanted to thank you for watching. This is the second video of the series Horrible Fates, so you may want to check out the other video in the series as well. If you want to support the channel, liking the video and dropping a comment down below helps push the video to a wider audience. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the
Hack the galaxy.
Thank you. Ready, guys? 1.
On a long enough timeline, the survival rate for everyone drops to 0. Although I think we all hope that we'll meet our end peacefully, surrounded by our loved ones, the reality for many people is that this is simply not the case. I really can't emphasize it enough. Although the story descriptions in this video are true to the events as they occurred, they are still highly disturbing. Viewer discretion advised. In Michigan, in the city of South Lyon, west of Detroit, there is an industrial tube manufacturer known as the Michigan Seamless Tube Plant. In essence, they create various lengths and sizes of metal tubing and piping. Raw metals and other materials arrive at the factory as cylindrical chunks that are then heated until they are white hot, at which point they are molded and hollowed out. The company also creates custom metal alloys and custom finishes on the metal for different industrial applications. Understandably, the factory has to use a variety of heavy machinery and harsh chemicals in the manufacturing process to create the final products. One such chemical they use in the manufacturing process is sulfuric acid. The combination of sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen creates a colorless, odorless liquid that is highly corrosive to everything from rocks to metal. In everyday life, sulfuric acid is highly unusual, but in industrial manufacturing, the liquid is remarkably common and is used in several different processes from fertilizer to mineral processing. Unfortunately, its prevalence in manufacturing doesn't make it any less dangerous. If you get sulfuric acid on your skin, it will cause severe acidic chemical burns that are not unlike the burns you'd get from heat. And just like getting burnt from heat, the chemical burns are extremely painful. It's destructive to all the tissues in your body and will dissolve your skin, your teeth, your eyes, and even your lungs, and you'll die if you get severe enough exposure. On Saturday, February 9th, 54-year-old Daniel Hill got up for work and drove to his job at the Michigan Seamless Tube Plant in South Lyon. He had worked for the company since April of 2017 and had just recently moved closer to the factory the previous July. According to neighbors of the Hill family, Daniel and the rest of his family were ecstatic to have moved to the countryside. By all accounts, they were nice, quiet people who were thoroughly enjoying their new area that was home to wildlife like deer and coyotes. Now, it's unclear exactly what transpired at the Michigan Tube Factory that day because details of the events are limited, but it seems as though the factory had a raised walkway of sorts above some large vats where they stored different chemicals for the manufacturing process. At some point during the day, some other workers at the plant noticed a man had fallen into one of the open vats and was at the side trying to pull himself out. They rushed over to him to try to pull him out, and they would manage to get him out, but not before getting burned from the piping hot liquid in the vat because that specific vat was kept at 160 Fahrenheit or 70 degrees Celsius. After pulling him out, they realized it was Daniel and rushed him over to one of the safety showers in the factory to wash off all of the chemicals. At this point, Daniel was still walking and talking, although probably in extreme pain from how hot the liquid was. Paramedics arrived at 12:21 p.m. and rushed him to Ann Arbor University Hospital and spent the next 11 hours providing him with medical attention, but unfortunately, Daniel would pass away later that day. It was determined that Daniel had fallen into a vat of 12% sulfuric acid solution and had burns over 100% of his entire body. So not only was the liquid extremely hot, it was extremely corrosive, ultimately contributing to his death. It's unclear exactly how Daniel fell into the vat or how long he was in the vat before anyone had noticed he had fallen in, but it seems as though he had fallen accidentally and was completely submerged during the initial fall. In an investigation of the incident, the Michigan Seamless Tube Plant received fines totaling $93,000 for several safety-related concerns, including zero training for at least 18 workers about hazardous energy sources. Orcas, or killer whales, despite their name, are actually members of the oceanic dolphin family and are the largest member of this group. With no natural predators, orcas are the apex predators of their environment and possess sophisticated hunting techniques due to their intelligence. They are also highly social and form stable family groups that pass unique vocalizations and behaviors across generations. Despite their status as apex predators, in the wild they are not considered a threat to humans and no fatal attack has ever been documented. In captivity, however, due to stress and boredom, orcas have been known to act aggressively towards themselves, their tank mates, and their handlers. In December of 1981, a male orca was born off of the coast of Iceland and was captured 2 years later in 1983. A year after that, he was transferred to Sealand of the Pacific in Victoria, British Columbia, where he was nicknamed Tillicum, or Tilly for short. Tilly would later grow to be the largest orca in captivity ever at 12,500 pounds and 22.5 feet long. His pectoral fins stretched 7 feet out on either side, and his fluke was 6.5 feet long, although it was collapsed as is typical of orcas in captivity. In his first years at Sealand, he lived in a tank with 2 older female orcas. As a result of their matriarchal social structure, Tilly was abused by the older female whales who acted aggressively towards the young male. It got to the point that staff at Sealand had to remove him from the tank and keep him in a smaller medical pool for protection. On February 20th, 1991, part-time trainer and marine biology student Kelty Byrne was cleaning the area around the tank when she slipped and fell into the pool with the 3 whales. When she slipped, she managed to grab the edge of the pool, so only half of her body was submerged, but as she tried to pull herself out, one of the whales grabbed her and pulled her under the water. In the wild, orcas can travel up to 100 miles in a single day, all while hunting and socializing at the same time. No matter how big the tank, the environment of captive orcas just can't replicate the stimulation that they would receive in the wild. In addition, the objects that they do receive in their tank are typically toys that they're allowed to play with. And so to the 3 orcas, Kelty was just a new plaything. The other trainers saw what happened and ran over and threw food into the water to distract them, but the whales continued to grab Kelty. They then tried to throw a lifeguard ring to her, but the whales kept her away from the ring so she wasn't able to grab it. Despite being a competitive swimmer, Kelty was just no match for the orcas. Twice while this was going on, Kelty surfaced and screamed, but the whales continued to pull her back under the water. She would eventually surface a 3rd time about 10 minutes later, but this time she was quiet. Kelty had drowned. This was the first time that anyone had ever been recorded being killed by an orca, in the wild or otherwise. It would take another 2 hours to recover her body, and when they did, all of her clothes had been stripped off and she was covered in bites and bruises. Tilly was moved to SeaWorld in Orlando, Florida soon after this incident, and Sealand was closed in the year following the death of Kelty. Despite this tragic event, Tilly resumed performing once again after being transferred to SeaWorld and would be without incident until 9 years later. On July 6, 1999, just after 7 a.m., a maintenance worker was cleaning around the breeding and research pool that Tilly was being held in and noticed a pair of legs draped over Tilly's back. The maintenance worker climbed upstairs to get a better look and would see that it was a man. He had no clothes, he was blue and discolored, and he had cuts and bruises covering his body. He was wearing swim trunks, but they were torn open at the seam and his genitals had been bitten off. It also seemed as though he had been dead for a few hours because rigor mortis had already set in. Paramedics arrived at 7:30 a.m. and pronounced the man dead, who was later identified as David Duke from the wallet found in his clothing that was found neatly folded by the pool. It was discovered that David had visited SeaWorld the day prior and stayed in the park after dark once it had closed. He then snuck through the park and around security to get to where Tilly was being held. The shows at SeaWorld emphasized the human contact with the orcas, and it's thought that David was under the false assumption that he could just get into the pool with Tilly and recreate the experience he saw at the show. But unfortunately, this incorrect assumption would ultimately cost David his life. Once again, Tilly resumed performing shortly after the incident. Although the deaths were tragic, each occurred during extenuating circumstances that were otherwise out of the ordinary. And so the assumption was that Tilly would not continue to pose a threat to anyone. And this assumption was correct for the most part. Tilly performed for years afterwards without incident. By 2010, Tilly was performing in a show called Dine with Shamu with senior trainer Dawn Brancho. At the time, Dawn was SeaWorld's poster girl. After graduating from the University of South Carolina with a degree in psychology and animal behavior, Dawn continued to pursue her passion, which was working with animals. She started working with dolphins at Six Flags, New Jersey, and outside of work, she volunteered at a local animal shelter and kept a number of rescued animals at her home. In 1994, she transferred to SeaWorld, where she would go on to perform with the orcas. Dawn was eventually promoted to senior trainer and appeared on various news agencies like NBC to talk about the demands of the job and all the ways she stayed in shape to continue to perform at a high level. She would go into detail about the marathons and cycling and weightlifting that she did for training. All of her work paid off, and the famous Dine with Shamu show with Tilly was the star attraction at SeaWorld. Dine with Shamu featured Tilly performing and eating in a pool while guests ate beside the pool watching the show at a poolside restaurant. On February 24th, 2010, during the end-of-show routine, Dawn was sitting at the edge of the pool rubbing Tilly's head. She was lying down on a small platform about a foot into the water, lying face-to-face with Tilly, when all of a sudden, Tilly grabbed her by the ponytail and pulled her under the water. At least a dozen people watched in horror as Tilly dragged Dawn around under the water and kept her submerged. Other trainers tried to use nets and food to distract Tilly, but nothing was working. For 45 minutes, they followed him around the different sections of the pool, trying to get him to release Dawn, and eventually they got him into a small medical pool where he let go of the now lifeless body. In the struggle, Tilly had severed her spinal cord, fractured her jaw, ribs, and vertebrae, dislocated her left elbow and knee, and removed her scalp from her head. An autopsy later confirmed that she had died due to drowning and blunt force trauma. In the aftermath, confirmed left elbow and knee, and removed her scalp from her head. An autopsy later confirmed that she had died due to drowning and blunt force trauma. In the aftermath of the event, SeaWorld was involved in a number of legal battles, but incredibly, Tilly would resume performing on March 30th, 2011. There were a number of new safety precautions put in place to minimize contact with him, and he would continue performing without incident until his death on January 6th, 2017. Controversy surrounding the incident, as well as allegations of animal cruelty from keeping highly intelligent animals in captivity like orcas, ultimately led to SeaWorld's decision in 2016 to end their breeding program. Eventually, their shows will be discontinued altogether when the last of the remaining captive orcas have died. On February 20th, 2003, in West Warwick, Rhode Island, a small concert took place at a local nightclub known as The Station. The headlining performance that night was the band Great White, and when all the other acts finished their sets, Great White got on stage and ready to perform. Someone in the audience was filming that night, and so there is a video of the entire event, but for those of you who are just listening, the video starts facing a dark stage in a crowd of people. You can hear people cheering as they waited for the band to start, and then the guitar comes in. Even more cheers can be heard, and then the pyrotechnics light up with the first big note of the guitar. In behind the band now are 2 jets of sparks illuminating them from behind. Let's start the clock. The lead singer can be seen dancing and singing as he moves his way back and forth across the stage. 5 seconds went by, and then the camera pans to the right side of the stage, and you can see a large jet of flame going from the sparks to the ceiling. Upon panning over, the cameraman immediately starts to move away from the stage through the crowd. There was now smoke visibly filling the room. 10 seconds later, the cameraman was at the edge of the large room, and the band had stopped playing after noticing the fire. The large jet of sparks had ignited the highly flammable acoustic foam on either side of the stage. 20 seconds later, the lead singer can be heard saying, "Wow, that's not good," as the cameraman made his way down a hallway. The crowd could be heard audibly saying fire, and the slowly moving mass of people was starting to make its way towards the exit. The acoustic foam was actually composed of 2 layers, one of urethane and one of polyurethane. Burning polyurethane produces a thick black smoke that is composed of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide gas. Only a few inhales of the smoke will cause a loss of consciousness and death shortly after if the person continues to inhale the smoke. 30 seconds in, the fire alarm was going off and the stage was engulfed in an inferno. The whole crowd was panicking now and moving quickly towards the door. 1 minute in, the screams around the building started and the black smoke billowed out of the corridor leading to the exit. One woman can be heard screaming, "Where's my husband?" over and over in the panic. The cameraman made it out of the building, and the audible screaming seems to be coming from the entire building at once. The cameraman then makes his way around the side of the building, and every window of the building was billowing the thick black smoke. At 1 minute and 30 seconds, the cameraman walked around the building to the front entrance and sees a literal pile of people jammed in the doorway of the building. In the panic, most of the crowd had headed towards the front door. It seems as though some people fell on the way out, and as the crowd continued forward, more people fell on top of them until the entire entrance was blocked by a mass of bodies. All that could be seen was their heads, arms, and torso as they struggled to free themselves. At 2 minutes, the cameraman is panning around the front side of the building, and people can be seen pouring out of the window beside the front entrance as black smoke pours out from behind them. At 3 minutes 30 seconds, the cameraman starts to walk around the building again and sees another entrance into what looks like a hallway that is empty but completely engulfed in flame. He yelled into the hallway to see if anyone was nearby, but there was nothing but flames. He continued walking around the building, and as he did, the screams disappeared in the distance and all he heard was the crackling of the fire. At 4 minutes 30 seconds, the camera pans to the roof of the building and there are flames escaping through it. The cameraman then walked back around towards the front of the building and the screams became audible once again. Fire trucks could also be heard in the distance, rapidly approaching. At 6 minutes, the cameraman rounds the building once again and sees that the entrance of the building was now completely engulfed in flames. By 9 minutes, the entire building was an inferno. The video continues for a total of 13 minutes and eventually, all of the screaming stops. Towards the end, the cameraman is filming the building from a distance as he walks through the parked cars in the parking lot. Of the 462 people in attendance that day, 100 people died, 230 were injured, and 132 escaped uninjured. The causes of death of the 100 people that died that day include burns, smoke inhalation, or crushing. Ultimately, the speed at which the fire spread, poor visibility, and the volume of people all moving towards a single exit contributed to the tragic events that occurred that day. However, the main cause of the events that day were the pyrotechnics in a relatively small room with a low ceiling. In the aftermath of the events, the club owners claimed that they didn't give the band permission to use the sparkler jets, while the band claims that they were given permission. It was also discovered that the station nightclub did not have a sprinkler system, which would have slowed the spread of the fire significantly. Due to the old age of the building and its size, the station nightclub was thought to be exempt from the requirement. It's unclear exactly how it passed fire inspection without this being noticed, but this would be another contributor to the events on that fateful day. The two owners of the club and the band's manager who set up the pyrotechnics were charged with over 200 counts of involuntary manslaughter each and received sentences of varying lengths. Incredibly, the station nightclub fire is only the fourth deadliest nightclub fire in US history. If you made it this far, I just want to thank you for watching. This is part 3 of the series, A Collection of Horrible Fates, so if you enjoyed this video, you may want to check out the other videos in the...
Hi, I'm Dr. Hilary Jones, and guys, I just want a minute of your time to tell you about a simple little device.
On a long enough timeline, the survival rate for everyone drops to 0. Welcome to another edition of A Collection of Horrible Fates. Today's final story is going to cover a particularly horrifying incident where the victims were powerless to their circumstances. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In 2003, a man named Hitoshi was working as a surgical resident at Christus St. Joseph's Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Unlike many people who are simply clocking in and clocking out at the end of the day for a paycheck, Hitoshi was really passionate about his work as a doctor. He had been a member of the 2003 class of the University of Texas Houston Medical School, where his classmates, also aspiring doctors, voted Hitoshi as the epitome of a good physician. It was during his time in medical school as well that Hitoshi had become a devout Christian and decided to become a missionary doctor. After he was finished his residency, his intention was to travel around the world as a doctor working in impoverished areas. At 9:30 a.m. on August 16th, a colleague of Hitoshi's, Karen Steinow, was heading up to her office on the 6th floor. She pressed the button for the elevator and then waited patiently for it to arrive. In the past couple of weeks, the elevator had been out of service, and so there was always a long wait time to use just the single working elevator. The elevator dinged, the doors opened, and then Karen stepped inside and pressed the button for the 6th floor. At the last second, right before the doors closed, Hitoshi quickly stepped into the elevator, trying to catch a ride with his colleague. Under normal circumstances, elevator doors don't shut when there's something between them, thanks to sensors mounted on the inside of the doors. There's also a set of contacts in the door that are supposed to prevent the elevator from moving if the doors aren't shut. But the elevator that they were using was still supposed to be out of service. The sign that indicated that it was out of service, that had been there for the last couple of days, had fallen off, leading Karen to believe that it was working properly. As Hitoshi entered the elevator, the doors that were already closing closed on his shoulders, pinning him in place. Then the elevator started going up, with Hitoshi still wedged inside the doors. Karen frantically reached and pressed the emergency button to stop it, but it was already too late. Hitoshi was partially decapitated by the ceiling of the next floor as the elevator continued to rise. The upper portion of his head that had been severed just above his lower jaw stayed in the elevator with Karen, and Hitoshi's body fell down into the elevator shaft all the way to the 1st floor. The elevator only finally stopped moving between the 4th and 5th floors, leaving Karen trapped with the top portion of Hitoshi's head until she could be rescued almost an hour later. She was later treated in the hospital's emergency room for shock resulting from the incident. Hitoshi's corpse was retrieved from the bottom of the elevator shaft, along with a few of his belongings, and his official cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries to the head and body. It was ultimately found that just a few faulty wires were responsible for the elevator malfunction, resulting in Hitoshi's tragic death. Taphophobia is the fear of being buried alive, and although this is extremely uncommon today, before modern medicine, this fear was not entirely irrational. Before the modern techniques used to check a person's vital signs, there were a number of cases where bodies were exhumed later and showed signs that the person tried to escape their coffin. This happened frequently enough that bells were installed in coffins so that if a person woke up, they could signal to people above ground they were not in fact dead. One well-documented case of premature burial was a woman named Alice Blunden in 17th century England. Alice drank a large quantity of poppy tea from unwashed poppy seeds containing the opioids morphine and codeine. The amount that she consumed caused her to pass out, and then a doctor mistakenly pronounced her dead. Alice's family quickly made the arrangements for her burial, but then just 2 days later, kids playing near where she was buried heard strange noises coming from the ground. The noises they heard were the muffled screams of Alice asking for someone to rescue her. The frightened kids told their headmaster what they had heard, but instead of checking out the noises, the kids were disciplined for telling lies. The following day, the headmaster finally checked the grave out for himself and heard Alice's cries for help. For whatever reason, the grave couldn't be excavated without proper permission, and so it wasn't until late in the day when the coffin was finally opened. Alice's hands and arms were bloody from trying to escape her coffin, and because she had just spent 2 days buried alive, she was actually now on the verge of death. Noticing this, her family returned her to her grave and had a guard stand watch overnight. That night when it started raining, the guard left his post and went to the local pub instead. The next morning, the coffin was opened once more and found that Alice had woken up again and tore her clothes and scratched at her body and face. She did, however, pass away after the second time being buried alive sometime that night. Alice Blunden remains one of the only documented cases of someone buried alive not once, but twice. And although modern medicine has limited the majority of live burials, every now and then someone is still accidentally buried alive. In 2011, a woman in Kazan, Russia collapsed at her home with chest pain. Suspecting a heart attack, she was rushed to the hospital, where she was unfortunately declared dead of a massive heart attack. Her family was devastated by the news of her passing and organized her funeral to be held 2 days later. Her funeral was open casket, and as the woman was lying in her coffin at her own funeral, she woke up to the sound of everyone crying and praying for her. When she realized what was going on, she started screaming and was immediately rushed back to the hospital. Unfortunately, she lived for only another 12 minutes in intensive care before she was pronounced dead once again. This time, she had suffered from complete heart failure due to the shock to her already weakened heart. On December 7th, 1941, Navy crewman John Anderson was stationed on the USS Arizona with his brother Hank Anderson. Just before 8 a.m., John was in the mess hall eating breakfast when a loud explosion shook the entire ship. John looked around and asked what the explosion was and saw that one of the cooks had his eyes glued to the port windows. He called John over and the two of them went out onto the deck and saw hundreds of planes in the sky bearing the iconic red dot of the Japanese Imperial Army. The two of them looked at each other and knew what that meant. According to John, everyone had a feeling that an attack was imminent. They just weren't quite sure when it would happen. And this was the attack that they had all feared. He ran back to sound the alarm on the ship, but before he could, a bomb literally fell in front of him and blew him inside a nearby hatch. Now the entire ship was being strafed by machine guns from the sky, and bombs were falling all around them. All he could hear were the screams of his crewmates as they were torn up by the assaulting gunfire. John sprinted over to a turret and jumped into the seat, ready to fire back on the Japanese ships, but there were no ships in sight. It was all planes. The turret he was sitting in didn't have the mobility to fire up into the sky, and so he told the captain that he wouldn't be any use just sitting there. Instead, he asked if he could go and join the fight with his brother on the upper deck of the ship, where he would be more useful. The captain gave him permission, and so John quickly asked a few other crewmen if they would come up with him, so they all started climbing up a ladder through a trapdoor to the upper deck. When they reached the top of the ladder, there was a massive explosion, and the shockwave that came from it knocked everyone across the deck. John was knocked on his back by the shockwave, and when he stood up and looked around, there was a man who was laying there unconscious and on fire. So he grabbed the man and dragged him out of the fire and patted him down to put out the fire, ultimately saving the man's life. Small rescue boats started pulling up to the side of the ship to transport people to shore, and John was ordered to get into one of the boats, but he refused. His brother was still on the ship somewhere, and there was no way he was leaving without finding out if he was still alive. Deep down, though, it's likely that John knew that the giant explosion a few moments ago had killed his brother. And the USS Arizona was sinking rapidly now, and any minute it would be fully submerged in the Pacific Ocean. John still refused the orders, explaining to the officers that he wasn't going anywhere without his brother. Then another bomb exploded on the turret that John had been sitting in just a second ago. The explosion sent it sliding off the side of the deck and down into the Combat Information Center, where it also exploded, killing a bunch of the officers inside. A lieutenant grabbed John and pushed him in the boat, and before John could react, the boat was already moving away from the ship and toward the shore. John cried out that he didn't want to leave, but there was just nothing he could do. But after getting to the shore and dropping off some of the wounded soldiers, John would actually convince the others to let him take the boat back to the Arizona. When he got back to the Arizona, he did manage to rescue 3 more crewmen who were right near the edge of the ship, but it was clear that anyone else who had still been on the ship could no longer be reached. Between the fire and the explosions, it was just impossible to get onto the boat and look for anyone else. John left the ship once again, knowing that his brother had almost certainly already died. Meanwhile, all of the bombing and machine gun fire was still going on all around them. On the way back to shore, a shell hit their boat and exploded, killing everyone but John. After all of the trouble of navigating through the machine gun fire, getting back to the Arizona, the mission ended up being in vain anyway. John was thrown into the water that was now coated with flaming oil leaking from the ships, so he had to swim as far as he could underwater, trying to surface outside of the radius of the oil. He would eventually make it back to shore, trying to look for survivors as he went, and when he got back to shore, he was so exhausted from swimming, he just collapsed onto the sand. He looked up into the sky, and there were so many Japanese planes still, he assumed that a new wave had been sent. As they got closer and closer to his position, he had no choice but to get up and run for cover. He took off running and luckily managed to find a rifle and some ammunition, and then took cover in a crater that had been made by one of the Japanese bombs. As he waited in the crater, another survivor happened to go by, and the two of them took shelter there for the night. The following morning, search and rescue operations happened to pass by the crater where John and the other survivor had taken shelter. The two men joined the group and were eventually sent to a nearby base on Ford Island, where they were greeted by 200 other members of the Arizona crew who had survived the attack. The attack that John and the others had just lived through is known infamously as the attack on Pearl Harbor. This attack by the Japanese Imperial Navy was actually a surprise attack on the still neutral United States during World War II. 353 Japanese aircraft were launched from 6 aircraft carriers stationed in the Pacific Ocean near the island of Hawaii, with the goal of crippling the United States Pacific Fleet. Over the course of 7 hours, there was a series of coordinated attacks on the Philippines, Guam, Singapore, and Hong Kong. In the attack, more than 180 US aircraft were destroyed, over 2,000 people were killed, and a further 1,000 were wounded. A number of important military bases